We're going to turn now to a panel discussion that involves Fiona and one other presenter. We're running about 15 minutes behind schedule, but we're not going to truncate this portion of the program at all because I think it's very key. We'll make up the time during the lunch break later. So we have about 90 minutes left, and the next hour is going to be presentations by two speakers, followed by a discussion between them. And the title of the session is Sir Walter Scott, The Crown and the Scottish Revival. And we'll hear them tell us exactly what that's all about. Fiona Armstrong MacGregor is going to stay with us. She's one of our presenters. And I gave you a bit of her background earlier, but let me just add that her dissertation, I understand, was on the subject of the Scottish Revival, aspects of it. So she's very well qualified to speak on that. Her fellow presenter, who I see is with us. Good morning, Caroline. Caroline McCracken Flesher is a professor of English literature at the University of Wyoming. Having said that, she is herself an Ulster Scot. Somewhere along the line, she lost a very distinctive Ulster accent. I never heard the story of how that happened, but she is in fact an Ulster Scot. She's an internationally recognized expert on the subject of Sir Walter Scott and his writings. She's written and lectured very widely on that subject, as well as on Robert Burns and other aspects of Scottish literature. Her extended bio is in your conference materials. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but she is a recipient of the Order of the Stag, pardon me, the Order of the Stag, which is a decoration from the Clan Scott. And I think that's in recognition of her expertise on the subject. So we're going to hear from these two very qualified ladies, and then we're going to have a discussion. I believe, Caroline, you're going first.
I believe that's correct. And so yes. I will share my screen to get us started. And Jamie will let me know if anything goes wrong, right? So I'm taking an assist from Walter Scott here, and you're going to see a lot of Walter Scott imagery. Our topic today is Scott, the Crown, and the Scottish Revival, as John Bellassai said. And in 1822, I'm going to talk about the King's visit and how Scott accomplished a major intervention between the Crown and the people. He made the Crown familiar and yet mysterious, and that's the crucial combination, according to the later monarchical historian Walter Bagehot. Bagehot thought that you needed to be careful about letting daylight shine on magic. And Scott knew how to do that, and he did it to great effect. Now, hindsight has linked Scott with monarchy and by his conservative politics, or politics that are assumed to be conservative. But this was not as likely an intersection as we might imagine. For Waverley in 1814, Scott takes as his epigraph, "Under which king Bezonian speak or die." That actually comes from To Henry IV by Shakespeare. And in the text, it's a little bit of a joke. And what Scott is pointing to is apparently there are kings, plural, and one is invited to choose. But one chooses, as Waverley found, under a certain duress. Waverley is actually not a very impressive young man. He's a bit of a clothes horse, and he's seduced by ignorance more than any particular political knowledge that he happens to have or investment that he has. So the Scottish relationship to monarchy also historically is quite vexed. Scott's early poems, such as The Lady of the Lake and The Lord of the Isles, feature internecine rivalries between Scottish lords and their kings. On the national level, history's rife, as you all know, with battles and uneasy allegiances, from the English defeat at Bannockburn to the installation of Charles II of Scotland, many months before he is crowned in England. And of course, once he went to England, he preferred not to come back north. And of course, the 1745 rebellion, where the Jacobites reached Derby before retreating to defeat at Culloden. So where did Walter Scott stand in this discourse of monarchy? His collections at Abbotsford are somewhat informative. This is one of the main cases in the library that shows Napoleon's blotter at the center. But it also includes memorabilia from Prince Charles Edward Stuart. And on the mantelpiece in the lobby, there's a cast of Robert the Bruce. So although Scott is British in his 19th century practicality, and Napoleon's blotter is a little bit of the spoil of war, he trends Scottish in sentiment. So how then did we get to 1822 with Scott wearing pretty much the Windsor uniform of blue jacket and buff trousers, welcoming George IV, who's got up in tartan? Scott's path lies, of course, through his literary accomplishments. He had started as a ballad collector, and the Duke of Buccleuch referred to The Lay of the Last Minstrel as one of the poems that then evolves from Scott's ballad collecting. So Scott was very much a keeper and arbiter of national culture. He went on to produce massively successful poetry and novels focused on Scotland. But while his output was Scottish through his early career, his cultural impact and literary standing made him a candidate for the laureateship of the United Kingdom, which in 1813 he turned down. And that made him, by 1815, someone George, as then Prince Regent, wanted to meet. And famously, they met for dinner at Carlton House, and they traded stories enthusiastically. They were both enthusiastic tale-tellers. From that relationship, Scott asked permission to retrieve the Scottish regalia. Now, the Scottish regalia was not lost. It was rumored to have been removed from Scotland, right? But in reality, it was in a chest at Edinburgh Castle, and it is retrieved, paraded with a certain amount of fanfare, and that actually fed the Prince Regent's taste for pageantry and the British past. 3 generations on from Culloden, George IV was actually a bit of a Jacobite fanboy. He collected Stuart memorabilia. He wore tartan in 1789, so well before his visit to Scotland, and he was a collector. And one of the things he was aiming to collect was Walter Scott. Now, by the time that the king arrives in Scotland, Scott has published, in terms of novels, this list on the left. He has published out of that 1 novel focused on England. But nonetheless, Walter Scott is a collectible. And in 1820, he is made a baronet. And then the king also commissions his portrait for a gallery of worthies in arts and sciences. And it's going to be hung, I believe it was at Windsor. And Scott was supposed to be the first one because that's where the king wanted to start. But if, when the king arrived in Scotland, Scott was the man in Scotland I most wished to see, he said, that was also because of Scott's standing independent of the monarch. George was crowned in 1821, and he was not having an easy time. Monarchs, by Walter Bagehot's standards, cannot live too long and retain their magic. Too much daylight shines in. And George, who had been a handsome young man, who was oppositional in his politics to his father, he was a Whig, had secretly married Mrs. Fitzherbert in a morganatic marriage, and he had then divorced. She was a Catholic, so he wasn't allowed to marry her, so the marriage wasn't actually legitimate. And he then had a long list of lovers, and he lived a life of excess. He had married Caroline of Brunswick, and then he had notoriously divorced her. So by the time he is king, he is the phrase that you've probably learned from Beau Brummel. Beau Brummel called him, after their long friendship went sour, he called him my fat friend. So in 1821, George was, on the one hand, now, finally, monarch of all he surveyed. And by the way, wearing a coronation outfit that he modeled on Napoleon's outfit for becoming emperor. But he was also being surveyed. And in this print on the right, Queen Caroline had been denied entry to his coronation in 1821. They were already divorced. She dies 19 days later. And he is both disliked and haunted by all these many pasts that he has accumulated. So from an English point of view, it was no bad thing for the king to leave town for a while. And he got quite a send-off, as you saw there at Greenwich. Scott had been actually very keen for the king to visit, writing to him on his ascension to the throne, asking him to come. And Scott, once the king did decide to come, and it was a late-breaking decision, but the city's worthies recognized that Scott had unique qualifications to assist with the visit. But what were those qualifications? Scott was an impresario. His most literally concrete theatrical achievement was rising in the Scottish borders at Abbotsford, which is a wonderful but somewhat stagey house, complete with wonderful, crenellations and towers and everything else. To build Abbotsford, Scott had collaborated with Daniel Terry, the actor-manager in London, on the architecture and the artifacts. And that Daniel Terry is going to come up again, because one of the criticisms of the King's visit to Edinburgh as staged by Scott was that it was a grand terrification. So Scott had been staging Scotland for 20 years. And that pun in the top left, by the way, is a pretty common one. He had been staging Scotland for quite a while, and his visions of pageantry had become authoritative, to the extent that the newspapers during the time of the King's visit didn't really know whether to credit him as a historian, although Scott always claimed that he really wasn't a historian, although he read very widely and knew his history. What he produced in his novels was something different. Or they also thought, well, was he a wizard of the imagination, and was that what they should invest in? But in either case, they considered Scotland as the impresario on the basis of all this work. And certainly Scott's novels did provide much of the pageantry and ceremony for Scott's visit. You can look at Waverley and look at particular ceremonies, and then you can look at the King's visit and see how they're recreated, and they don't necessarily have a foundation in history. Moreover, Scott knew quite well what George liked. Waterloo had put an end to the Napoleonic Wars, but as they raged, one of George's major claims to fame was in inventing a fancy uniform for his regiment, because he really liked dress-up games. And now, with Scott as stage manager, history, or its appearance, blended with a certain amount of pageantry and a strong sense of cultural distinctiveness, offers a unique branding opportunity. And the visit was a number of staged vignettes. At the bottom, you can see the arrival at Leith. He arrives at Leith. He is welcomed by Scott. And in a very effective scene, Scott presents him with a St. Andrew's cross worked in pearls by the ladies of Edinburgh. So that's the sublime moment, right? But at the same time, it's ridiculous. Scott, or the King, when he departs from the ship on his way to shore, he is met by, we are told, Mr. Knox, who was walking on the water. I have struggled to find out more about Mr. Knox and how he came to be walking on the water. I'm not quite clear on that, but that's in the record. Scott also asked from the King the glass from which the King had drunk that he could have as a memorial of the King's visit. And in the enthusiasm of the day, he stuck it into his rear pocket in his tailcoat, and then promptly sat down on it later, forgetting that it was there. So we've got the sublime, the front stage stuff, and we've got the backstage stuff, where there's a certain amount of awareness of the construction of things, and things go wrong, and the production of this moment. So George did, nonetheless, accomplish a regal entry to Edinburgh. It's much like Turner's vision of the Jacobites coming into Edinburgh, but it happened also, of course, between the showers, et cetera, et cetera. George gets to the castle. He waves from the bastion. He is so overwhelmed by emotion looking down at the sea of tartan that he's quite touched. And the crowd down below, however, is stepping on one another, jostling for a glimpse of really a teeny tiny person up on the castle bastion. George reviews the troops on the shore at Portobello. He dines with all the Edinburgh worthies at the Provost's banquet. And he's feasted on various Scottish dishes. And meantime, some of the people in attendance, people like John Grant of Rothley Merchants, are working really hard to position themselves close to the King by sending braces of ptarmigan to the King where he was staying at Dalkeith House, or also whiskey. Everybody was recognizing that this was a really good branding opportunity. George welcomed the ladies to the levee. Now, the levee is the morning ceremony. The King is, it's a little bit inauthentic to begin with, right? Because the King is not really in an undress. He's in his morning dress, in this case, kilted. And he's meeting people on his getting up. So already a little bit inauthentic. And Scott had coached people on how to behave at the levee, right? You had to retire backwards. He said, for the ladies, this is going to need some practice because you'll have a long train on your dress. He also told them what to wear. He didn't calculate. So front stage, backstage, he didn't calculate for an aged Scott. He was a little bit confused by the instruction about how to kiss hands, which meant that you kissed the king's hand. And this gentleman retired backwards, blowing kisses as he went. So there's an authenticity, but also a staginess to everything, and also an unpredictability to things. There's an apparent mystery. Only a few ignored the daylight, but maybe they went together also in a kind of interesting way. So what did the visit accomplish? Well, as you can see here, it was roundly parodied as a festival of overeating and overinvestment in ladies, which was one of George's besetting sins. George was considered in the London press to have caught an itch when he went to Scotland. As you can see, if you can read the tiny writing, the itch he may have brought with him from London from his attachment to the ladies, but nonetheless, George did catch a little bit of an infection in Scotland. And what was it? Well, he caught Scottishness. He caught an investment in things Scottish. In Scott's hints that he wrote to train Edinburgh in how to respond to a visiting monarch, he talked about the blood of the Bruce coming over the border. Now, in George's veins, that blood would have been pretty thin, but nonetheless, it was a compelling idea. Scott talked about the king come into his own again, right? As if he had ever been there before, he was now returning. Even the less invested of papers picked up this language. So the Scotsman picked it up, for instance, and Blackwood's talked about the king having eaten our bread and sat at our hearth and become one of the family, basically. He's the chief of chiefs. And George really gets into it. He not only dresses up in tartan, he would prefer, he says, he requires Scottish dances. And as you saw in the last image, he was a little bit of a poser. When David Wilkie showed the sketches for this painting, it actually showed the king leaning forward to receive the keys. And George said, oh, no, I wasn't like that. I was like this. And he strikes a much more regal pose. Where is he getting these regal poses from? Well, he also watched Rob Roy while he was in Scotland. One of the highlights of the visit was a visit to Scott's Rob Roy, staged in the theater there. And again, on stage, things looked really great. Out front of house, there was a massive crowd that swirled around, and again, everybody jostling for position until one Highlander just hoisted himself on everybody's shoulders and scuttled across to get to the front door. But George is picking up his poses from the theater to some degree, because here is Macready in Rob Roy pose. And that's the pose that kind of pose that George adopts. So those are some of the complexities of the magic and the daylight, right? But how might we measure the success of this visit? Is success a word that we can use? We certainly know that it produced some investments in Scotland that we're a little suspicious of. Would it be a measure of success that the king recuperated his brand? Well, not necessarily for Scotland, right? But the king did have a fine time. Or that the king bought into the brand? Well, that may depend on your goal and what he then does with it. Does it matter that Scott achieved a major manifestation of Scottishness through a particular set of signs of the north of Scotland post-1745? Scott hailed the clans to Scotland. He wrote lots of letters. He also hailed the Celtic Society, which was just an assemblage of people who were friendly to things Scottish. And backstage, front stage was all these people marching, along through Edinburgh. Backstage, he's writing letters that say exactly the same thing to all these clan chiefs. They say, well, we really can't do this well without you. It really needs you to, swell it out and make it look good. So it's a little bit of a mass production. Is a measure of success that the populace had a pretty good party. As you can see, there were medallions struck. There were illuminations at night. This is not one, unfortunately, from the King's Visit itself, but it gives you a sense of the detail that could be shown in a transparency to celebrate an event. And this is a transparency to do with the Queen. But there were illuminations at night. There were parties. There were gatherings. The grants of Rothy Murchis, remember John Grant, who sent the ptarmigan. Elizabeth Grant didn't get there, but her two sisters did. And they spent a lot of time talking about walking out at night to see the illuminations, how exciting that was, getting their hair done alongside Mrs. Siddons, the actress, and even getting kissed by the king. Oh my goodness. Is a mark of success that Scotland became visibly distinctive internationally. Not least because of tartan. Tartan had been proscribed. It now went mainstream. It's not that it had been invisible. And that's why I want to share this sequence of pictures with you. Because on the left, you can see Alistair Ranulph MacDonald of Glengarry, which was a painting by Angelica Kaufman in 1800, and he is wearing his tartan. David Stewart of Garth, military hero in his tartans, and was a big help during the King's Visit. Evan Murray MacGregor, also a major player during the King's Visit. This is his 1822. And George IV, of course, in his outfit, which cost a grand £1,354, apparently, and multiply that many times to understand how much he spent on trying to look like the way Scots could look and then making it more visible. But what happened here was tartan going mainstream and becoming one of the world's biggest brands through a pretty canny stage manager who was deploying one of the era's unwitting influencers. George was pretty sure he was an influencer, but he didn't know that he was being used to be influential in this way. Nonetheless, it's wise to remember that George actually went to Ireland first in 1821, pretty promptly after his coronation. In Scotland, they like to think they were going to do things better than in Ireland, and the Scots wrote some pretty negative and very funny things about the King's arrival in Ireland. However, the King's arrival in Ireland was pretty impressive too. Also, George, when he went to Ireland, had already told the people there, "I have long wished to visit you. My heart has always been." In 1821, it was Irish. When he went to Hanover a few months later, it was Hanoverian. When he went to Scotland, it was, of course, Scottish. But however many places the king left his footsteps, there's Howth on the left, or his heart, the Scots had actually managed to get him out of his pantaloons and into something more political and more saleable. And Scott knew to what effect. Cultural recognition, which we tend to undervalue, is a change maker. Scott ramped up Scotland's presence and influence in the 19th century through a visible sign. And as Edinburgh felt when it witnessed Scott in a kilt, George IV in a kilt, complete with, his kilt was supposed to be too short and his pink fleshings too obvious, as they felt when they saw him in a kilt, whether that was a good thing really depends on how and where and when you look. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn over to Fiona Armstrong to talk about how tartan gets carried forward and this impetus from George IV's visit gets carried forth in the succeeding years. Thank you.
Caroline, thank you very much indeed. What a fascinating presentation there. I'm learning things all the time, I really am. And isn't it amazing to think how tartan has swept through the world and how far it's gone after that 1822 visit. So let me now share my screen here. Right. There's the Honours of Scotland. And I think you heard what I said about the Honours of Scotland, but you see Sir Evan MacGregor of MacGregor there in the middle, surrounded by his men. Cost him an absolute fortune to kit all these people out, these clansmen. And apparently when it was all over, the clansmen went off with all their finery, including their silver dirks, etc. So here's another picture of Sir Evan MacGregor of MacGregor. We saw it in Caroline's presentation, and it really shows what a flamboyant man he was, clan chief, military hero, never one to hide his light under a bushel, a swashbuckling figure here, and one made more colourful and romantic by the cloth that he is wearing. Tartan is almost enabling these men and the women to be like gods and goddesses. It's something unique, it's something different, it's something that makes them stand out. Well, fast forward about 20 years, and we've got this lady here, somebody else who would be spearheading the tartan craze. This time a woman, which quite unusual in those days, although ladies did wear tartan. Victoria, Queen Victoria. She came to the throne, the British throne, in 1839. She'd never visited Scotland, and she would not do so for another 5 years, but she did love Walter Scott. There we are, you've got a young Victoria. Now, she had met the writer, Walter Scott, when she was a teenager, and she hero worshipped him. She absolutely did. He is my beau ideal of a poet. I do so admire him in both poetry and prose. Now, the Victorian writer Theodore Martin noted how on a visit to Scott's house, Queen Victoria, or Victoria, hesitated when asked to sign his journal. She was just a queen, or going to be a queen after all, and he was the great Walter Scott, the great man, the great novelist. As she said at the time, I felt it would be presumption to sign his journal. Victoria would go on to have a whole room decorated with scenes from Walter Scott's works, because his novels were what first gave her the image of Scotland, this image of a romantic tartan land, this image of a place with mountainous beauty. It was the land of the monarch of the glen and the Highland warrior. It was the abode of the kilted piper, where a clansman saluted his chief or his queen. Through Walter Scott, a whole fantasy world had opened up for Victoria. The Highlands would allow her to mix with the common folk and to tramp the hills undisturbed. It would be a long way from the London crowds, from oppressive courts and fawning courtiers. And if she fell in love with the Highlands and with tartan, so did her other half. Here we've got Prince Albert, her husband, a European, very European man, far from home, but looking very much like a clan chief, like the plaided part. He could be a clan chief like that, the size of his sporran as well. And there he's got his faithful deer hound next to him, and behind him the paintings of the mountains. Because at this stage, the royal couple had made themselves a Highland home. Here we have it, Balmoral. Looks a bit stern and austere there, doesn't it? Balmoral Castle in Aberdeenshire on the banks of the River Dee. It came complete with tartan carpets in the hall and tartan lino in the kitchen, because the royal couple, this royal couple, were turning seriously Scotch. They now had their own tartans. There's the Balmoral one. Victoria also had her own tartan, which was a white one with a touch of colour through it. They were eating porridge for breakfast. We're doing all the Scottish things you had to do, eating porridge for breakfast, dancing reels, learning Gaelic. Albert could be seen striding round the castle with a great Gaelic dictionary under his arm. They would support local Highland games, especially the Braemar gathering. And importantly, the Queen now had her own piper. She would have several pipers in her life, in her reign as queen. This one was Angus here, and you can see him, he's got his green, rather smart green tartan on, and got the bagpipes there, and again, you've got the Highland scene in the background. So piping would become a must for Queen Victoria. She had her own piper, and her piper would play under her window every morning. There's no doubt that Queen Victoria fell in love with the Highlands. She once famously said, "For Jacobite blood is in my veins," which is a strange statement coming from somebody whose ancestors were almost unseated by a Jacobite rebellion. But she was very proud of the Jacobites looking back. She could sort of reword history, as it were, and say, "For Jacobite blood is in my veins," and be proud of it. It's quite interesting to note that Victoria was on the throne for 63 years. And of that time, she spent 7 years in Scotland. So out of her 63 years reign, she spent 7 of that in Scotland. And you can compare that to the 5 weeks she gave to Ireland and the 7 nights she gave to Wales. So you can see how much she really did like Scotland. And just like her uncle George IV, where royalty went, others followed. They were dressing the part, they certainly were. Here we are. They were coming on holiday in the Highlands. They were coming to fish and stalk and walk the mountains because the Highlands were seen as health-giving. They'd been building great homes here, Highland homes here, for some time, and more were now being built. They were finding a clan to belong to. Thanks to royal endorsement, Scotland was now a place of plaid, of clan chiefs and pipes. And was this a good thing? The reinvention of Scotland, the remaking of Scotland, which started in the second part of the 18th century and carried on to the 19th century, has become known as a phenomenon called Highlandism. Now, Highlandism in its simple form is not a thistle, or a thistle does sort of sum up Scotland. Highlandism in its simplest form is how Scotland came to have a tartan face. Several groups came together to make this happen. Several things came together. Among them, the British Army, dressing its soldiers, its Highland regiments in tartan, the aristocracy, of course, longing to wear tartan, and of course, Queen Victoria. Not everybody is happy about this Highlandism, this reinvention of Scotland. Tartan, piping, the noble Highlander. Did this royal view of the Highlands mask what was really happening in Scotland in Victorian times? Yes, it did, I'm afraid. The writer Ian Mitchell calls Highlandism, the way the Highlands were reinvented, as a great neo-feudal nonsense. He calls the Highlands were reinvented as pageant, he says. The Highlands were starving, and in Glasgow, the slums of Glasgow, they were sleeping 12 or more to a room. Whilst Victoria and Albert were living the Highland dream, the Highland clearances were underway. And indeed, Victoria and Albert became patrons of several clearance societies. The historian Michael Patterson reminds us that despite a growing and prosperous middle class, the majority of Queen Victoria's subjects in Scotland were very poor. Others have stronger views. This whole Highlandism, the tartan revival, has been called the tartan monster. Mind, some critics might not have approved of anything that the royal family did. And talking of the royal family, oh, there is Lord Semple there. He's one of the aristocracy who took to wearing the Highland uniform. And here we have the royal family, and you can see the little boy there in tartan, one of the princes, he's got his tartan on as well. This family, the royal family, certainly wasn't poor. Yet, tartan monster or not, there's no denying that tartan has given Scotland a unique identity. As Caroline has touched on, tartan as a marketing tool is the envy of the world. You see a picture of this cloth and you know exactly which country we're talking about. Tartan has fueled the tourism industry. It's given a boost to the textile industry. It's helped create jobs. It's also engendered a feeling of belonging across the world, so that those with Scottish blood feel they can invest in Scottish castles, perhaps, in restoring Scottish ruins or setting up clan centres. I think I would like to say thank you to Victoria for promoting tartan. She may have seen Scotland as a land of stags and loyal gillies, yet she appeared to have been a decent landlord there at Balmoral. There on the estate, Victoria and Albert improved conditions for people living there. All the living conditions were enhanced. Then a regal connection has boosted Deeside generally. Royal tourism in the town has brought the money in. It's created jobs, as we've already said. And I actually think that being in the Highlands helped to make the Queen Victoria a better person. Here, she could mix with the poor, she could go into cottages, she could talk to old ladies, she could go and spin with old ladies in the Highland cottages. And I think that gave her some sort of common touch. Victoria did not start the tartan trend, but she did encourage it. So do we think that Victoria did Scotland a favour by championing tartan? That will be discussed, I think. The clan chief Ian Moncrieff, also a very good writer and historian, he argues that without Victoria, Scotland might have continued to be a mere backwater called North Britain. Whatever you think of Highlandism and tartan, or the tartan monster or not the tartan monster, tartan has really helped Scotland find an identity. And over the years, the royal family have continued to wear tartan. Here we've got Edward, Prince of Wales, in his Highland costume, and there's a bit of heather behind him in the background. Here we have another royal. These pictures all courtesy of the Royal Collection Trust, from the Queen's website. And there we have the young princes, I think they're all princes, and maybe the one at the front with princess, also at Balmoral, dressed in their little tartan bits as well. So, clan chiefs can continue. Oh, wait a minute, that's the Queen and the late Prince Philip, the late Duke of Edinburgh, and they're there at Balmoral dressed in their tartan. So royalty has continued to wear tartan, to wear the kilts, and to promote Scotland through that wearing of the tartan. And here we are, finally. Let's fast forward. This is the MacGregor and I at a Florida Highland Games, and with us a very keen clansman and woman that we met while we were there. And if you want an example of how Highlandism exists today, how it's continued throughout the ages, you probably don't get a better example than that. We're all there top to toe in tartan, and we're flying the flag for Scotland. And there we are, Caroline. You and I are now going to have a discussion, I believe.
I believe so. And I've got lots of questions.
Have you? Go on, fire away. Apologies for that bit at the top. I'm not the world's most technical person, but I'm so glad we managed to get something out there.
Could I just say before you start that at the end, we're going to take some questions. So if you all have questions, just type them in the chat box. I'll see them, and I'll field them to our two presenters. We have about 20 minutes for this, so take it away.
Okay. Oh gosh, Fiona and I have been talking on and off about this topic for some considerable time, right? I think since you were working on your dissertation too. I'm curious now as I think about this. I think about it very much in the context of a book by David McCracken and his colleagues called Scotland, the Brand, right? And he goes through some of this situating through tartan up into very modern industries, just as we saw in the previous panel that was discussing, the fashion industry in Scotland. And I'm curious about where we all think this is going now, right? I think tartan seems to come and go. It came back big time with Alexander McQueen, who was producing high-end fashion, but situating it within tartan and invoking in some of his shows Scottish history very directly. And so I'm wondering where we think this goes now, and what are the strengths of it or the problems with it now? Have we got past the moment where Tom Nairn was saying, Scotland was all about sporranry and a various set of negative things, and tartan had fallen into disrepute? What do we think about where it's going now, and is that just a cycle? Or is it always going at different paces in different populations? That's, I think, another question.
Well, I think it did fall into disrepute back in the 70s and 80s. That was when you got a lot of writers, historians and critics saying, look, we are more than just tartan. You know, tartan was a false invention. And in a sense it was, because the tartan we have today, the industry that's grown up, is nothing like the simple plaid, that the shepherd's plaid that they used to wear hundreds of years ago. It's nothing like the kilt that you see today. It's nothing really like the garments that the iron workers used to wear in Scotland. And the old tartans were very muted, of course, and today's tartans are incredibly bright. I mean, some of them, the bright yellows and the reds, etc. And they're really dazzling. And, as we touched on earlier, I wonder what somebody like Walter Scott would have made of it. But I do think that tartan has, to a certain extent, been given a reprieve over the years by some historians who do now argue that, yes, it has a value to Scotland, not just as a marketing tool, but also as an identifier, something that brings communities together around the world. And I would think tartan isn't going to go away, let's put it that way. And as the lady said in the film we saw earlier from Loch Carron, the managing director from Loch Carron, Dawn Robson-Bell, today there are tens of thousands of tartans, and I can only see that growing because, individuals can get tartans. I mean, Caroline, I don't know if you've got a tartan, have you? I mean, I wear the MacGregor tartan. I also wear the Armstrong tartan. I could wear the Dumfries tartan, the Queen of the South tartan, because I'm the Lord Lieutenant for Dumfries, etc. But yeah, have you got a tartan?
My background is so complicated. I'm not quite sure what I can legitimately wear, but I think that brings up a really good question, right? About what does it mean to legitimately wear something? And there are a whole set of things tied up with that, right? I was just very taken with the Ian Mitchell comment about how this was feudal nonsense, right? And that assumes a certain lineage for tartans, assumes, the people who are most present at the king's visit are often aristocrats or important people, right? But there's also a whole set of people out in the town also participating, not necessarily able to purchase tartan, but actively participating. And so I think one of the things that carries forward as an anxiety from the king's visit is because, exactly as you said, it's sort of lined up at the moment when dispossession of Highland lands is happening, right? When clearances are happening. And some people, like the Countess of Sutherland, basically she tries to recuperate her credibility by having a strong presence of her Highlanders at the king's visit and parading in their tartans. And so that's very much the sort of the feudal aristocratic deployment. I mean, she's very sincere in many respects, but she's also very unawares but somewhat strategic nonetheless in other respects. And so there's that element of it. But then there's also the question of who owns any kind of culture and who gets to participate in any kind of culture and who gets to wear things. And I'm very interested. I think I'm now skipping over a number of subjects, but I'm very interested in how this is also the moment at which we're already going through a textiles revolution by the 1820s, right? We've had the agricultural, we're into the industrial. A big part of the industrial revolution is textiles. And so the mass production of tartans is more possible. I'm not enough of a historian of that particular industry to know when it gets its big impetuses and when mass-produced tartans become purchasable by people who are not very wealthy. Because it's a high labor production, right? Either you're producing it at home, in which case it might be quite varied, and not a tartan that's connected with a particular group or clan. It's just what you have, and then the tartan that's inexpensively produced, generally produced. Interestingly, it's labeled for particular groups, right? That becomes a big thing after the 1820s, but is available. And then that tartan perhaps does a different kind of work for a different people. I think that comes up for Tom Nairn because one of the things that annoys him about tartan in the 1980s is that it's become such a feature at football matches. And he doesn't, and he associates that with other things and with the depressed population. But he recognizes how important that is to building community, which is one of the things I think you talked about a lot, how tartan builds community.
Yeah, you talked about, we've sort of touched on tartan being trivial, and there's no doubt there's a lot of tartan tat out there. And, everybody's heart sort of sinks when you see you Jimmy hat with a bit of tartan on it or whatever. And you mentioned the lady aristocrat and getting her tartan made, etc. Well, I've got another story about that. During the 1822 visit, the Elliots, which are a border clan, they wanted to go to Edinburgh. And Walter Scott said to them, of course, you can't come to Edinburgh unless you've got a tartan. So they beetled off to the local textile place. And the Countess of Minto, as she was then, Lady Elliot, got a tartan made. It's a beautiful blue one. It's got a hint of red running through it. It really is a gorgeous tartan. But she had it made that colour to match the colour of her eyes. And and then, you think, well, was that, I suppose that was quite when there's so much Scottish poverty around. But then, the aristocrats had the money, they had the power, they could do things on a whim, I suppose. But interestingly, another point we could touch on is that we're talking about tartan as being called the tartan monster back in the 1980s and being slightly derided. And this isn't all that Scotland has to offer. But it's very interesting that today, this nationalist movement that's risen, the SNP, you see them out on their processions, etc., and their rallies. And to a man and a woman, they will be wearing tartan. So it's almost like, the nationalists, politically, it's become almost acceptable again because you see the Scottish National Party wearing it. I think tartan's come a long way, but it probably needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. And there are all sorts of issues. I know that the tartan manufacturers have created all sorts of different tartans for the clans, and some are acceptable to the clan chief, some are not acceptable to the clan chief. I know my own husband, chief of Clan Gregor, he has a couple of tartans that he endorses. One is the MacGregor red and green. The other is the black and red, which is a black and red check. Now, the tartan it was always referred to as the black and red, but the tartan manufacturers have called it the Rob Roy tartan. And my husband, as the clan chief, says it's not the Rob Roy tartan, it's a MacGregor red and black. And it was called the Rob Roy because, imagine going into a shop and saying, well, going in and saying, I'll have the MacGregor red and black. How much more romantic to go in and say, oh, I'd like some Rob Roy MacGregor tartan, please. So, it's become a big business. And but I don't think tartan is harmful. It's not harmful. It can get a bit silly if it's overdone, but,
I like what you just implied about how shareable it is, right? That it can cut across populations these days. And I think that's partly because while on the one hand, tartans can be designated, on the other hand, they're also widely purchasable, right? I, for instance, do have a Jimmy hat. I think it's hysterical. I bring it out for various University of Wyoming and Scotland affairs. And, when we're fundraising, we auction things like that. And also what we're calling the Helga hat, which is, the one with St. Andrew's cross and the red braids. And they are the big selling items. They're the ones that get people to bid big money if any of us out there are fundraisers. And so I think you're right. If we can be a little bit relaxed about it and recognize that to some degree, I think signs like this in any culture do get taken out of your hands, right? They get developed for other purposes, and they drive for Scotland a pretty active, or they support an active tourist industry, and very profitably so. But there's also part of that is how playful they can be. And, one of my favorite tartan, when you're asking what tartans I wear, right? So there's this one that I bought in a National Trust shop. And I have no idea if it's anything in particular, but it is very pretty. But my absolute favorite tartan is actually the one that's linked to the Antarctica science station. I've forgotten what it's called, but it has the colors of an emperor penguin. And if anybody out there has not seen this tartan, for real, it is gorgeous. And I hope that some funding goes to the Antarctica Research Station by its purchase. But so tartan is not. I think it's. If we could step back from it a little bit and think of it, about it not so much as a property, but as a shareable phenomenon, right? Tartan is also a method, a way, a phenomenon in a weave, right? And that can be done almost anywhere, and is, as I say, very shareable. And I think it's one of the gifts that Scotland has, right, to be able to share that. And so I do remember when it used to be that you could see the Burberry tartan traveling around the world, and that's clearly a branding item. And yet there's a certain charm to seeing that branded item come back to Scotland around the necks of people who are far distant from Scotland. Yes, I think there's a lot of pleasure in tartan. And however it gets its stops and its starts, that's one of the things that we can embrace about it. I'm also struck about how tartan has done a particular work for Scotland. And it came up in some of the previous discussion that it's hard to think of places where a cloth has accomplished that much branding for its population, right? And I was interested, just thinking about it. What are the equivalents? When we go to particular countries, or what particular things are we seeking? If we go to Pamplona, some of us, not me, think that the thing you do in Pamplona is run with the bulls. Well, it's a whole lot easier to wear some tartan. And what's more, you can take it home with you. What are the equivalents? So it's been a remarkable opportunity, I think. But there are also equivalent fabrics elsewhere, because it is really just a pattern of a weave, right? And how much you put into it. You can see keffiyehs in Jordan, right? Herbawi keffiyehs from Hebron have similar but different weaves with distinctiveness linked to place. So I think it's just intriguing to think about how this particular cloth got such a start. I'm seeing that there are a number of questions for us, starting with one for you, Fiona, in the chat.
Okay.
Someone's asking if you could speak out about tartan, and that many of the shops in Princess Street are not selling authentic tartan or products. Can anything be done about that? I think the previous session talked about that a little.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's a slight concern that where we live in the borders here, there's still a number of weavers, tweed manufacturers, tartan manufacturers, textile manufacturers, should I say. But they are diminishing in number. One stage here in the Scottish borders, tens of thousands of people were employed in the weaving industry, and they would be making tartan, they would be making tweed, etc., all those sort of things. But now there may be half a dozen weavers left locally. So some of it, I would imagine, some of this work has gone overseas to places like China and India, and when it comes from these places, presumably they can make it rather more cheaply than we can make it here in Scotland. I think there was some fuss a couple of years ago about tartan for the Scottish Regiment, which there was an idea they were going to have it made in the Far East. I don't know how far that got, whether it actually came to fruition or not, but there was a big hoo-ha because people said, no, our tartan must be made here in Scotland for our Scottish regiments. So the question was, what can we do about cheap imports in the shops in Princess Street?
Authenticity. Can nothing be done by the Scottish government or other people in Scotland to stop this practice that may fleece tourists who are not aware of this and only considering the lowest prices? And then there's this related question: is it important to tell tourists that if tartan is too cheap, it's probably not made in Scotland, to make sure they get the real thing?
So yeah, I think they should be told, absolutely. And all I can say is possibly the best places to order your tartan from are, the tartan manufacturers, people like Loch Carron. I know there are other manufacturers as well. There's half a dozen of them there in the Scottish borders to actually go to a special tartan site. Because I know there are shops in Princess Street that do sell tartan. I don't know where it comes from. It maybe local tartan, I'm not sure. But just going back to what we were discussing before, I think that over the years, Scotland has really proved to be more than tartan. I mean, if you think about it, everything, the inventions that came out of Scotland, not least the television, Scotland continues to lead the world in various things. So people who say, oh, Scotland is just tartan, has been just tartan, that's not true. Scotland is much more than tartan. And I think that tartan just adds a colour and a romance and a sort of excitement as a brand.
We've got a question here from Claire Campbell, who was, of course, is a weaver and was on a previous discussion this morning. Claire asks, what would your view be of tartan in the future, history being made by the present time? What would you like it to see it be in the future?
I would like to see it still here. I think we're all a little worried after recent meetings that we might not be still here. But I was very taken by the last panel and the talk about sustainability. I'm also somewhat torn, though, because I think that the discussion that Claire and her colleagues had about sustainability absolutely is to the fore. And, we want authenticity in terms of the production of tartan. Although I'm all for the shareability of it as well. And when I get to the shareability and what work that sharing has done for Scotland with people who perhaps don't know, or, they have a tartan, they're proud of it, they possess a piece and don't really know where it came from, don't really know how it was produced or whatever. On the one hand, I think the sustainability piece is really, really strong and how to brand that. But on the other hand, I would hate to see plaids and tartans not available, because just that phenomenon does such a work for Scotland in the world. And so it's how to do both those things from my perspective. I'm actually okay with people going down Princess Street and buying something that's perhaps a little inauthentic, but signals something to them about the place they've been and the richness that it has and the welcome that it offers.
I think if people are after authentic tartans, a very good place to start would be the Scottish Tartans Authority website, because they will point you in the right direction. If you want authenticity, if you want to know that this was made in Scotland and it is your clan and it is sanctioned by them, you'll know you're getting the right thing. So if anyone's got any worries about authenticity, that's probably a good place to start.
But I think it would also be lovely to just answer Claire's question very specifically, to have a modern Scottish tartan that is directed toward how inclusive and thoughtful and forward-looking a country Scotland has become and is right now. Scotland leads in some very important global discussions, but it leads by inclusion of voices from across the world and within Scotland. And I would love to see that reflected in a tartan.
And you were talking about tartan uniting the world, being an inclusive thing, bringing people in so they can share in it. And you just have to think about, the Indian pipers, the pipe bands all dressed in their tartan. Or I was looking the other day, Nigeria has a pipe band now and they've all got their tartans on. You've got people like the Singh brothers, Indian businessmen who develop their own tartan right across the world, from banks to building societies, just individuals, sports people, clubs, etc. They are wearing tartan and they're proud of it. And I think by doing that, they are really, they're in one way they're making a statement for themselves, but in another way they're flying the flag for Scotland, aren't they? You're quite right.
You think, ladies, there's a way to this is a pet subject of mine, to divorce tartan from politics? It's always been associated with politics. I mean, we have paintings of lowland ladies from 1707 and previous to that who were wearing tartan to show their opposition to the Act of Union. And you were mentioning how the SNP seems to have embraced tartan today. Of course, they have a political message about independence, but it seems to constantly get wrapped up in politics, which means that somebody's for it, somebody else has to be against it. Is there a way to separate tartan as simply the fabric of a nation and the cloth of a people from the politics it sometimes gets wrapped up in? How do we do that?
I'm not really sure. I wish it wasn't wrapped up in politics or claimed by politicians and politics. But you're right, ever since Prince Charlie, led his Jacobite rebellion, there he was dressed in his tartan. So yeah, it can become, tartan can become weaponized. It can become really political. And I'm not sure how you get around that.
I think there's one really important thing, which is that any cultural sign like this can be appropriated, right? It can be used, not just between political parties, it can be used for causes that you really would deplore, right? So then the question is, you can't stop that. The question then becomes, what message does Scotland want to send as not the only place in which this fabric is produced, right? But the place for which is a major cultural sign. What message does Scotland wish to send out with that, right? And is that message one about the bigger world, about sharing a thing of, in this case, beauty, and of welcome? So I go back to what I said about, that's what I think I want the next tartan to be, one that speaks to the world and tries to include, and that message should go out as part of tartan. Tartan is always a weave of multiple strands, right, made visible. And I think that is perhaps one of the marketing strengths that is also a social message.
I wonder if there is a world tartan. We'll have to ask the Tartans Authority if they could enlighten us. I certainly know there's a lunar tartan. It was taken by Armstrong when he went to the moon, and he left a little piece there on the moon. So a bit of Armstrong history is up there on the moon now, which is quite nice to think of. So tartan travels, certainly does. Tartan's traveled all over the world, hasn't it?
It's very popular in Japan. The King of Jordan's pipe band wears a tartan, and everywhere you turn. Japanese tourists to America love to hear about the clans and see the tartans. Of course, they have their own feudal history, and they're conscious of their past at the same time that they're a modern nation. I think Scotland can do that too. Do we have any final questions for our panelists before we say goodbye to them and move on to the next panel? I want to thank you both very much. Very interesting session. Anyone else?
I think it's worth repeating Claire Campbell's last comment, where she says, this is the message we share daily, uniting global shared values with integrity. 21st century communities have evolved, and we are part of that. I think that's a great place to end.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed it is. I would direct everybody to take a look at the peace tartan, which was mentioned yesterday in the program. I think that's something we can all embrace, and it certainly has a worldwide message to it. Thank you, ladies, both very much. And I hope you'll stay with us.